On the morning of October 14, 1907, a railway clerk named Martin Gehrig walked into the Colorado Springs police station and reported that he had been missing. The statement itself was unusual enough to warrant documentation. The desk sergeant, Patrick Mallory, recorded in the daily log that Gehrig appeared considerably diminished in weight, coherent but reluctant, and that he had walked the 17 miles from the abandoned Cripple Creek mining camp known as Ashford Gulch. When asked where he had been for the previous 11 days, Gehrig said he had been at the camp. When asked what had happened to the 4 men who had accompanied him, he said he did not know. When pressed for details, he placed both hands flat on the sergeant's desk and said, with what Mallory later described as terrible calm, that he would not discuss it further. He never did. Martin Gehrig was 31 years old at the time of his return. He was employed by the Denver and Rio Grande Railway in a clerical capacity, a position that required exactitude, discretion, and an even temperament. His supervisors described him as reliable. His neighbors in the modest boarding house on Cascade Avenue described him as quiet, neither warm nor cold, the kind of man who kept his own counsel. He attended church irregularly. He did not drink to excess. He had no wife, no children, no visible debts. There was nothing in his character prior to October 1907 that suggested he was capable of either great violence or great endurance. And yet he had survived something that 4 other men had not. The missing men were identified within 48 hours. They were James Trask, a mining engineer, age 42, Albert Sonka, a Hungarian-born assayer, age 37, William Dunmore, a surveyor and mapper, age 29, and Peter Lyle, a photographer and occasional journalist, age 26. All 4 had been part of a privately funded geological survey intended to assess the viability of reopening several dormant claims in the Ashford Gulch area. Gehrig had been brought along to manage correspondence, supply inventories, and financial records, a role he had performed on 2 previous expeditions without incident. The men had departed Colorado Springs on October 2, 1907, carrying provisions for 2 weeks. They had planned to return no later than the 16th. Gehrig returned alone on the 14th. The other 4 men were never seen again. A search party was organized within 72 hours. It included 2 deputy sheriffs, a physician, a civil engineer, and 11 volunteers, many of them miners familiar with the gulch. They reached the camp on October 17th and found it in a state of partial abandonment. The tents were still standing. The supply crates had been opened, but not emptied. There was no sign of struggle. There was no blood. There were no bodies. What they did find, however, was more troubling. Inside the largest tent, the one that had served as a communal sleeping and eating area, there were 5 bedrolls. 4 of them appeared to have been slept in recently. The 5th, Gehrig's, as he later confirmed, had been dragged to the far corner of the tent and placed against the canvas wall, as if to create distance. On the makeshift table, constructed from planks and barrels, there were the remnants of a meal: beans, hardtack, coffee grounds in tin cups. 5 cups. The food had begun to spoil, suggesting it had been left for several days. But there was something else. One of the cups had been overturned. Deliberately, it seemed. The coffee had spilled across a stack of survey maps, staining them dark brown. In his formal report, Deputy Sheriff Howard Kinsman noted, "The arrangement of effects suggests departure in haste, though not panic. No valuables were taken. Personal items, watches, tobacco, a harmonica, remained in place. It is the opinion of this office that the men left the camp of their own volition, but under circumstances that remain undetermined." The surrounding area was searched extensively. The terrain around Ashford Gulch is unforgiving. Steep rock faces, dense pine forest, ravines that drop 200 feet or more. There are mine shafts, some unmarked, dating back to the 1890s. There are places where a man could fall and never be found. The search continued for 9 days. They found nothing. No clothing, no tools, no trace. Martin Gehrig was questioned repeatedly. The transcripts of these interviews, preserved in the El Paso County archives, reveal a man who answered every factual question with precision and refused to answer anything that required interpretation or speculation. Did he know where the men had gone? No. Did they leave together or separately? He did not know. Was there an argument? He did not say. Was there an accident? He did not say. Did he see anything that would explain their absence? He did not say. His lawyer, a man named Ernst Vogel, who had been retained by Gehrig's employer, advised him to cooperate fully. Gehrig did cooperate in a sense. He provided a timeline of the days leading up to October 4th, the last day he could confirm seeing all 4 men alive. He confirmed the route they had taken, the supplies they had purchased, the work they had done. He confirmed that relations among the group had been, in his assessment, normal. But when asked what happened after October 4th, he said only, "I remained at the camp. I do not know where the others went." When pressed, he repeated the statement. When threatened with charges of obstruction, he said he had told the truth and had nothing further to add. When the district attorney suggested that withholding information could make him complicit in whatever had occurred, Gehrig looked at him directly and said, "I have not withheld information. I have withheld interpretation." It was a strange answer, too precise, too considered. It suggested that Gehrig understood the difference between what he had seen and what he believed, and that he had decided, for reasons of his own, that only the former was subject to testimony. The investigation continued for 5 months. The families of the missing men demanded answers. Peter Lyle's mother, a widow living in Boston, wrote letters to the governor, to the railway company, to the church. She received polite replies that offered sympathy but no clarity. James Trask's brother hired a private investigator, a former Pinkerton man named Raymond Krill, who spent 3 weeks in Cripple Creek interviewing witnesses and examining the camp. His final report concluded that no evidence of foul play could be substantiated, but added in a handwritten note that the surviving party's refusal to provide context suggests either trauma or concealment, the distinction between which cannot be determined. By March of 1908, the case was effectively closed. The 4 men were declared missing, presumed dead. No criminal charges were filed. Martin Gehrig returned to his position with the railway. He was reassigned to desk work in Denver, a transfer that his supervisor later said was made in consideration of his recent ordeal. But Gehrig did not speak of an ordeal. He did not speak of it at all. In the years that followed, there were occasional attempts to revisit the case. A journalist from the Rocky Mountain News sought an interview in 1910. Gehrig declined. A writer working on a book about unsolved disappearances in the Colorado mining country sent a letter in 1913. Gehrig did not reply. In 1918, during the influenza epidemic, a minister visited him in the hospital where he was recovering from pneumonia and asked gently if there was anything he wished to confess or unburden. Gehrig thanked him for his concern and said there was not. He lived another 34 years. He never married. He retired from the railway in 1935 and moved to a small house in Pueblo, where he kept a garden and read extensively, history mostly, and some poetry. Neighbors described him as courteous and self-sufficient. He attended a Lutheran church but did not socialize. He was seen occasionally walking alone in the foothills east of town, always in the early morning, always returning by noon. He died in 1942, at the age of 66, of a heart condition. His estate was minimal. His possessions were donated to charity. Among them was a single leather-bound journal, purchased in 1906, its pages entirely blank. There was no funeral service. He had requested cremation, and his ashes were scattered in a location he had specified in his will, the South Fork of the Arkansas River, near the old rail line, a place with no particular significance to anyone who knew him. The people who had known him, few as they were, remarked afterward that he had seemed, in his final years, neither troubled nor at peace. He had simply been present, quiet, intact. The silence he had maintained in 1907 had never broken, and in that silence the question remained. Not what happened to the 4 men who disappeared, but why the one who returned chose never to say. The expedition to Ashford Gulch was not the first time these men had worked together, though it was the first time they had worked as a unit. James Trask, the mining engineer, had employed Albert Chonka on 2 previous surveys in the San Juan Range. William Dunmore had collaborated with Trask on a freelance basis, providing topographical maps for mineral claims. Peter Lyle had been brought in by Dunmore, who knew him through mutual acquaintances in Denver's small community of technical professionals. Martin Gehrig had no prior relationship with any of them. He had been hired by the railway company, which had a financial interest in the survey, to ensure that expenses were properly documented and that correspondence with investors was maintained. In other words, they were not friends. They were colleagues assembled for a purpose. And yet, by all accounts, the days leading up to their departure were unmarked by tension. The expedition had been organized over the summer of 1907. The financial backers were a consortium of investors based in Chicago, men who had made money in railroads and steel and were looking to diversify into mining. The Ashford Gulch claims had been abandoned in 1902 after a series of cave-ins and labor disputes. The ore that remained was low-grade, but there was a belief, based on incomplete geological data, that deeper deposits might justify the cost of reopening the shafts. Trask had been hired to assess the viability. The others had been hired to support him. They met for the first time on September 28, 1907, at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. The meeting was brief. Trask outlined the scope of the work. Dunmore reviewed the maps. Chonka discussed the assay process. Lyle explained that he would be documenting the expedition photographically, both for the investors and for potential publication. Gehrig took notes. The tone, according to a waiter who later testified during the investigation, was professional and cordial. There was one moment, however, that the waiter remembered. It occurred toward the end of the meeting. Peter Lyle, the youngest of the group, had made a joke. Something about the last time he had worked in the high country and had nearly frozen to death. The others had laughed, except Gehrig. The waiter recalled that Gehrig had smiled politely but had not joined in the laughter. He had, instead, written something in his ledger. It was a small detail. Meaningless, perhaps, but it was noted. The following week the men made their preparations. Trask secured the necessary permits. Dunmore reviewed the existing survey maps and identified 3 primary sites within the gulch that warranted examination. Chonka arranged for the transport of assay equipment, fragile glass vials, scales, chemical reagents. Lyle packed his camera, a cumbersome bellows-style apparatus that required glass plates and careful handling. Gehrig compiled a list of supplies: food, tools, medical provisions, lanterns, rope. They departed Colorado Springs on the morning of October 2nd in a hired wagon, driven by a man named Samuel Oakes, who had been contracted to take them as far as the old mining road. Oakes later testified that the men were in good spirits. They spoke about the weather, which was clear and cold. They spoke about the route. Trask mentioned that he had worked in the area once before in 1899, and that the terrain was difficult but manageable. Chonka mentioned that he had a sister in Boulder and planned to visit her on the return trip. Dunmore said very little. Lyle asked questions about the mine, about the elevation, about wildlife. Gehrig sat apart, checking his ledger against the crates of supplies. Oakes dropped them at the trailhead late in the afternoon. He helped them unload the wagon. He shook hands with each man and told them to be careful. He said he would return on the 16th to collect them, as arranged. Trask thanked him and said they would be ready. Oakes drove back down the mountain and did not see any of them again, except Gehrig. The hike to Ashford Gulch took the better part of a day. The camp itself was located in a narrow valley, sheltered by high rock walls on 3 sides. It had once housed 40 men during the peak of the mining operation. Now it was a scatter of collapsed structures, rusted equipment, and a single standing cabin with a partially intact roof. The men set up their tents in the clearing near the cabin. They built a fire. They ate a cold supper. According to the daily log that Gehrig kept, a log that was later recovered and submitted as evidence, the first night passed without incident. October 3rd was spent unpacking and organizing. Trask and Dunmore walked the perimeter of the valley, identifying the locations of the 3 mine entrances they intended to examine. Sonka set up his assay equipment inside the cabin, where it would be protected from the elements. Lyle tested his camera and took several photographs of the camp and the surrounding landscape. Gehrig inventoried the supplies and noted in his log that 1 crate of canned goods had been damaged in transit, though the contents were still usable. That evening, they gathered around the fire. Trask reviewed the plan for the following day. They would begin with the northernmost shaft, which was the most accessible. Sonka would take initial samples. Dunmore would sketch the interior layout. Lyle would photograph. Gehrig would remain at the camp to maintain the inventory and prepare the evening meal. It was a reasonable division of labor. Gehrig had no expertise in geology or surveying. His presence in the field would have served no purpose. And yet in the margin of his log entry for October 3rd, Gehrig wrote a single sentence that was later the subject of much speculation. Agreed to remain. No objection raised. The phrasing is odd. Why would an objection be raised? Gehrig's role was clerical. Remaining at the camp was the logical assignment, and yet he felt it necessary to note that no one had objected. It suggests, perhaps, that the possibility had occurred to him. On October 4th, the 4 men left the camp at first light. Gehrig recorded their departure in his log. LO6 30 hours. Trask, Sonka, Dunmore, Lyle departed for North Shaft. Expected return 1600 hours. They did not return at 1600 hours. They did not return at all. In his log entry for October 4th, Gehrig wrote, no return by 1800 hours. Fire maintained, supper prepared, awaiting arrival. The entry for October 5th reads, no return. Weather clear. Supplies adequate. Position unchanged. The entry for October 6th reads, no return. The entries for October 7th, 8th, and 9th are identical. No return. On October 10th, Gehrig wrote, departed camp 0700 hours, searched North Shaft area, no evidence of presence, returned to camp 1500 hours. On October 11th, searched East Ridge, no evidence. On October 12th, searched South Ravine, no evidence. On October 13th, remained at camp, decision made. On October 14th, departed for Colorado Springs. The log was factual, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It contained no speculation about what might have happened. It contained no expression of concern, fear, or confusion. It was the log of a man performing a task. But there was one additional detail. In the margin of the entry for October 13th, Gehrig had written 2 words and then crossed them out. The ink was heavier than the rest of the text, as if the pen had been pressed down with force. The words were, they knew, crossed out, but legible. During questioning, Gehrig was asked about this notation. He said he did not remember writing it. When shown the log, he acknowledged that the handwriting was his, but stated that the phrase had no significance. When asked what they referred to, he said he could not say. When asked what they knew, he said he could not say. The interrogator, a deputy named Lawrence Fitch, noted in his report, subject became visibly uncomfortable when pressed on this point. Not evasive, but resolute. Stated again that he had nothing further to add. Interview concluded. It was the closest anyone came to breaking through the wall of Gehrig's silence. But it was not close enough. The North Shaft at Ashford Gulch had been dug in 1897 during the second phase of the mining operation. It descended at a steep angle for approximately 200 feet, before leveling into a horizontal drift that extended another 300 feet into the mountainside. The support timbers were old, but according to the survey notes left by the original engineers, still sound. The shaft had been sealed in 1902 with a wooden barrier and a posted warning, danger, no entry. James Trask had seen the warning. He had also seen the engineering notes. His assessment, recorded in a letter to the Chicago investors dated September 15, 1907, was that the shaft could be safely entered for the purpose of sample collection, provided that proper precautions were taken, lanterns, rope, and a 2-man buddy system. He recommended that the team spend no more than 3 hours inside on any given day. On the morning of October 4th, the four men carried with them 2 lanterns, 100 feet of rope, Chonka's sampling tools, Dunmore's measuring instruments, and Lyle's camera. The entrance to the shaft was a 15-minute walk from the camp, uphill through loose scree and scrub pine. They were seen leaving the camp by Martin Gehrig. He was the last person to see them alive, or so he claimed. The question that haunted the investigation, and that continues to haunt the archival record, is this. What happened between 06:30 hours, when Gehrig recorded their departure, and sometime later that day, when they ceased to exist as men who could return? There is no physical evidence. There are no witnesses. There is only the landscape, the abandoned mine, and the silence of the man who remained behind. But there are fragments, testimonies, implications. The search party that arrived on October 17th examined the north shaft extensively. The wooden barrier had been removed and set aside, confirming that the men had entered. Inside the shaft, they found evidence of recent activity, fresh boot prints in the dust, scuff marks along the walls, and a single lantern, extinguished, lying on its side approximately 50 feet from the entrance. They found no bodies. They found no blood. They found no sign of collapse or structural failure. The timbers were intact. The air, though stale, was breathable. The floor of the drift was level and clear of debris. In his official report, Deputy Kinsman wrote, "The shaft was examined to a depth of 180 feet. Conditions within were consistent with safe passage. No evidence of entrapment or injury could be identified. It is the conclusion of this office that the missing parties exited the shaft of their own accord. But if they exited, where did they go?" The search party fanned out across the surrounding area. They checked the other 2 shafts, both of which were partially collapsed and showed no signs of entry. They checked the ravines, the ridgelines, the dense timber to the east. They found nothing. One member of the search party, a miner named Carl Dietrich, later gave an interview to a reporter from the Colorado Springs Gazette. He said that the thing that troubled him most was not the absence of bodies. Men disappear in the mountains all the time, but the absence of logic. If they'd had an accident, we'd have found something, a tool, a piece of clothing. If they'd gotten lost, we'd have found tracks leading away. If they'd been attacked, by an animal, say, or by someone, there'd be signs. Blood, a struggle. But there was nothing. It was like they walked into that mine and then just stopped being. He paused, then added, "Or like someone made very sure we wouldn't find them." When asked if he believed Martin Gehrig was responsible, Dietrich said he didn't know. But he said that if Gehrig had been involved, he would have expected the man to show some sign of it. Guilt, fear, something. Instead, Dietrich said Gehrig had seemed empty, not cold. Dietrich clarified, empty, like he'd already decided what he was going to say and what he wasn't, and everything else just didn't exist for him. The reporter pressed, "Did Dietrich think Gehrig was lying?" Dietrich thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "I don't think he was lying. I think he was doing something worse. I think he was telling the truth, just not all of it. The distinction is important. A lie can be challenged. A partial truth, delivered with precision, is nearly impossible to break. And Gehrig was nothing if not precise. There is one additional piece of evidence from the search, though its significance remains unclear. Inside the cabin where Chonka had set up his assay equipment, the searchers found a small notebook belonging to William Dunmore. It was a field journal, the kind surveyors used to record measurements and observations. Most of the entries were technical: elevation markers, compass bearings, sketches of rock formations. But on the last page, dated October 4th, there was a single line written in pencil: "Trask insists. I have misgivings." That was all. Trask insists. About what? The decision to enter the mine? The depth they would descend? Something else entirely. I have misgivings. About the mine, about the group, about Gehrig, who had remained behind. The notebook was submitted as evidence. Gehrig was shown the entry during questioning. He was asked if he knew what Dunmore had been referring to. He said he did not. He was asked if there had been any disagreement among the men before they left. He said there had not, to his knowledge. He was asked if Trask had insisted on anything unusual. He said he could not say. The phrase "I cannot say" recurs throughout the transcripts. It is Gehrig's most consistent answer. Not, "I don't know." Not, "I don't remember," but "I cannot say." It is the language of a man who knows exactly what he is withholding. During one particularly tense exchange, the district attorney, a man named Horace Penfield, asked Gehrig directly, "Did you kill those men?" Gehrig looked at him without expression and said, "No." Penfield pressed, "Did you harm them in any way?" "No." "Did you abandon them when they needed help?" "No." "Did you fail to help them when you could have?" Gehrig paused. It was a long pause, long enough that the stenographer noted it in the transcript. Then he said, "I cannot say." Penfield leaned forward. "You cannot say or you will not say." Gehrig met his eyes. "I cannot say." It was not an admission of guilt, but it was not a denial either. It was something else, something that suggested the question itself was impossible to answer, not because Gehrig didn't know, but because the answer would require him to betray something he had decided must remain protected. The interview ended shortly thereafter. No charges were filed. Gehrig was released. But the question remained, and remains still. What happened in the hours after the four men entered the north shaft? Did they find something they shouldn't have? Did they see something that changed them? Did they turn on each other? Did Gehrig, despite his denials, play a role? Or did something else occur? Something that Gehrig witnessed but could not, in good conscience or in self-preservation, ever speak of? The land around Ashford Gulch does not give up its secrets easily. The mines are deep. The forest is thick. The winters are brutal. Men have disappeared there before. Men have died there. The earth does not care. But the earth does not keep journals. It does not refuse to testify. It does not sit in a lawyer's office and say with terrible calm, "I cannot say." Only a man does that. Only Martin Gehrig did that. And the silence he chose became, in the end, louder than any confession could have been. The pressure on Martin Gehrig began almost immediately and continued in various forms for the rest of his life. In the weeks following his return, he was questioned by local law enforcement, by railway company representatives, by a hired investigator, and by attorneys representing the families of the missing men. Each interrogation followed a similar pattern. Gehrig answered factual questions with precision and declined to speculate, interpret, or elaborate. He confirmed what he had done, where he had been, and what he had observed, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, he offered nothing. The families were not satisfied. Peter Lyle's mother, Elizabeth Lyle, traveled from Boston to Colorado Springs in November of 1907. She was a widow of modest means, a woman who had raised her son alone and who had pinned her hopes on his success as a photographer and writer. She requested a meeting with Gehrig. He agreed. The meeting took place in the office of Ernst Vogel, Gehrig's attorney, on November 9th. No transcript exists, but Vogel later wrote a letter to a colleague in which he described the encounter. Mrs. Lyle, he wrote, had been composed but insistent. She had asked Gehrig to tell her what had happened to her son. Gehrig had expressed sympathy but stated that he did not know. She had asked if Peter had suffered. Gehrig had said he could not say. She had asked if Peter had been afraid. Gehrig had said he could not say. At this point, according to Vogel, Mrs. Lyle had begun to weep. She had asked Gehrig if he believed her son was dead. Gehrig had said yes. He believed all four men were dead. She had asked how he could be certain. Gehrig had said he could not be certain, but that he believed it to be true. Then she had asked the question that would be repeated in various forms for years. If you know they are dead, why won't you tell me how? Gehrig's response, as recorded by Vogel, was brief, because it would not bring him back. Mrs. Lyle had stared at him. Then she had risen, gathered her coat and left the room without another word. Vogel noted that Gehrig had remained seated, motionless, for several minutes after her departure. When Vogel asked if he was all right, Gehrig had said, "I am as I should be." It was a strange answer. Not, "I'm fine," not, "I'm sorry," but, "I am as I should be," as if his condition, whatever it was, had been deliberately chosen. The families did not stop pressing. James Trask's brother, Richard, a prominent attorney in Philadelphia, wrote letters to the governor of Colorado demanding a formal inquest. The governor declined. Richard Trask then wrote to the U.S. Department of the Interior, arguing that the disappearances had occurred on federal land and warranted federal investigation. The department replied that local authorities had jurisdiction and that the matter had been thoroughly examined. In 1909, Richard Trask published a pamphlet titled The Ashford Gulch Silence, A Case for Justice. It was a detailed account of the disappearances, the investigation, and Martin Gehrig's refusal to cooperate. The pamphlet argued that Gehrig's silence was evidence of either complicity or cowardice, and that the legal system had failed to hold him accountable. The pamphlet circulated widely in Colorado and beyond. Copies were sent to newspapers, to churches, to civic organizations. It created a stir. Several editorials were written. A Denver Post columnist called for the case to be reopened. A minister in Colorado Springs delivered a sermon on the moral duty of truth-telling, referencing the case without naming Gehrig directly. Gehrig did not respond. He did not write a rebuttal. He did not grant interviews. He continued to work for the railway company, to live in his modest boarding house, to attend church irregularly. If he was aware of the pamphlet, and he almost certainly was, he gave no indication. His employer stood by him. In a letter to Richard Trask, the railway's general counsel wrote that Gehrig had been fully cooperative with authorities and that no evidence of wrongdoing had been established. The letter added that Gehrig was a valued employee whose character and conduct have been exemplary, but there were consequences nonetheless. In 1910, Gehrig was transferred from Colorado Springs to Denver. The official reason was administrative reorganization, but those who knew the case understood it differently. The transfer was a way of removing Gehrig from the community where the disappearances had become a public wound. It was easier to forget him if he was elsewhere. In Denver, Gehrig kept to himself even more than before. He rented a small apartment near the railway offices. He did not socialize with his co-workers. He was punctual, efficient, and entirely unremarkable. A supervisor from that period later recalled that Gehrig was the kind of man you could work alongside for years and never really know. But there were moments, brief, easily overlooked, that suggested Gehrig was not as detached as he appeared. In 1912, a new clerk was hired at the Denver office, a young man named Thomas Erskine. Erskine later recounted, in a letter to a friend, an incident that occurred during his first week. He had been sorting files when he came across a folder labeled Ashford Gulch Survey 1907. Out of curiosity, he had opened it. Inside were copies of the supply manifests, the correspondence with investors, and the log that Gehrig had kept. Erskine had been reading the log when Gehrig appeared beside him. Gehrig had not said anything. He had simply reached out, closed the folder, and placed it in a desk drawer. Then he had looked at Erskine and said quietly, "That file is complete. There is no need to review it." Erskine had apologized. Gehrig had nodded and returned to his own desk. But Erskine remembered the moment because of the way Gehrig had looked when he closed the folder. Not angry, not embarrassed, but something else. Something that Erskine described as profoundly tired. The years passed. The case faded from public attention. The families one by one stopped hoping for answers. Elizabeth Lyle died in 1916. Richard Trask abandoned his campaign in 1918 after the outbreak of war shifted the nation's focus. Albert Shanka's sister returned to Hungary. William Dunmore's wife remarried and moved to California. The missing men became a historical footnote, a curiosity, a story told occasionally in mining camps and taverns, embellished with speculation and rumor. Some said the men had struck gold and been murdered for it. Some said they had been caught in a cave-in that Gehrig had caused. Some said Gehrig had gone mad and killed them all. Some said the mine was cursed. None of it was true, or if any of it was true, there was no evidence. And Gehrig, the one man who could have confirmed or denied any of it, said nothing. In 1923, a young historian named Valerie Marsh wrote her master's thesis on unsolved disappearances in the Colorado mining region. She devoted a chapter to the Ashford Gulch case. As part of her research, she wrote to Martin Gehrig, asking if he would consent to an interview. He wrote back, a brief, polite letter stating that he had nothing to add to the public record and wishing her well in her research. Marsh later wrote in her thesis, "The surviving party's refusal to provide testimony suggests a deliberate choice to protect something, whether himself, the deceased, or the truth itself, that he deemed more valuable than public understanding. This choice, maintained across decades, speaks to a conviction that transcends fear of legal consequence. It speaks perhaps to a kind of loyalty. It is an interesting interpretation. Loyalty. To whom? To what? The men who disappeared were not Gehrig's friends. They were colleagues, hired for a task. They had known each other for less than a week. What loyalty could have formed in such a short time? And even if it had, why would it demand silence? Unless the loyalty was not to the men, but to something they had shared, or something they had done, or something they had become. In 1935, Gehrig retired from the railway. He was 60 years old. He moved to Pueblo, a quiet town south of Denver, and lived the remaining years of his life in near total isolation. He gardened, he read, he walked. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. He did not attend social gatherings. He did not form friendships. In 1940, a reporter from the Pueblo chieftain, unaware of the Ashford Gulch case, knocked on Gehrig's door to ask if he would participate in a feature about longtime Colorado residents. Gehrig declined. The reporter, noting Gehrig's age and the era he had lived through, asked if he had any stories from the old days. Mining booms, railroad expansion, anything of interest. Gehrig had smiled faintly and said, "I have no stories." The reporter pressed gently, "Everyone has stories, Mr. Gehrig." Gehrig had looked at him for a long moment. Then he had said, "Perhaps, but not all stories are meant to be told." He closed the door. It was one of the last times anyone attempted to speak with him about the past. When he died in 1942, the local obituary listed him as a retired railway clerk. It mentioned no family. It mentioned no significant events. It was 4 lines long. There was no funeral, no service, no gathering. His ashes were scattered, as he had requested, in the South Fork of the Arkansas River. And with that, Martin Gehrig, the man who had returned when 4 others had not, ceased to exist in any public way. But the silence he had created did not cease. It persisted. It deepened. It became, over time, the only monument to the men who had disappeared. Because in the end, silence is not the absence of an answer. It is an answer in itself. A historian examining the Ashford Gulch case in the present day is confronted not with a mystery of fact, but with a mystery of intent. The facts, such as they are, can be arranged with reasonable certainty. 5 men entered a remote mining camp in October 1907. 4 of them disappeared. 1 returned and refused to explain why. The investigation found no evidence of foul play, no bodies, no clear cause. The case was closed. The survivor lived another 34 years and never spoke of what had happened. These are the facts. But facts, in a case like this, are only the skeleton. The flesh, the meaning, is elsewhere. It resides in what was not said, in the choices that were made, in the silences that were maintained. And Martin Gehrig's silence was not accidental. It was not the silence of a man who did not know. It was not the silence of trauma, though trauma may have played a role. It was not the silence of fear, though fear too may have been present. It was the silence of a man who had made a decision. The question is, what was that decision? One possibility is that Gehrig was guilty of something, murder perhaps, or criminal negligence, and that his silence was a form of self-preservation. This is the interpretation favored by Richard Trask and others who believed Gehrig should have been prosecuted. It is not without merit. Gehrig's refusal to provide details, his careful use of language, his evident discomfort when pressed, all of this could suggest a man hiding a crime. But there are problems with this interpretation. If Gehrig had killed the men, why return at all? He could have disappeared into the wilderness, claimed to be a fifth victim, and never been found. If he had caused their deaths through negligence, why not invent a plausible accident? A rock slide, a fall, a sudden illness. Gehrig was intelligent and composed. He could have constructed a story that would have satisfied investigators and families alike. Instead, he chose the far more difficult path. He told a partial truth, and then refused to elaborate. He invited scrutiny. He endured interrogation. He accepted suspicion. And he did all of this while maintaining that he had done nothing wrong. This does not fit the behavior of a man concealing guilt. It fits instead the behavior of a man protecting something he believed was more important than his own reputation. Another possibility is that Gehrig witnessed something so traumatic that he could not speak of it, not because he chose silence, but because he was incapable of breaking it. This interpretation treats Gehrig's silence as a symptom of psychological injury rather than a deliberate act. There is some evidence to support this. Gehrig's physical appearance when he returned, considerably diminished in weight, according to the police report, suggests deprivation or extreme stress. His demeanor, described as calm but also empty, could indicate dissociation, a common response to trauma. The fact that he never married, never formed close relationships, and lived in near total isolation could suggest a man who had been irrevocably altered by what he had experienced. But again, there are inconsistencies. Gehrig was not incoherent. He was not confused. He answered questions with precision. He maintained employment. He functioned by all outward measures as a competent and reliable person. If his silence had been the result of trauma, one would expect to see other signs of breakdown, and those signs are absent from the record. Moreover, there are moments in the transcripts where Gehrig's silence seems less like an inability to speak and more like a refusal. When asked if the men had left the camp voluntarily, he said he did not know. When asked if he believed they were dead, he said yes. These are not the answers of a man who cannot process reality. They are the answers of a man who knows exactly what he is saying and what he is not. A third possibility, and the one this historian finds most persuasive, is that Gehrig's silence was an act of protection, not of himself, but of the dead. Consider the evidence. Gehrig never denied that he knew what had happened. He said repeatedly, "I cannot say," not "I don't know," not "I don't remember," but "I cannot say." The phrasing suggests constraint. It suggests that Gehrig possessed knowledge, but had decided, for reasons he deemed valid, that he could not share it. Why would a man withhold information about the deaths of 4 people unless he believed that revealing it would cause harm? Perhaps the truth was unbearable. Not in the sense of being traumatic to Gehrig, but in the sense of being damaging to the memory of the men who died. Perhaps they did something in those final days that Gehrig believed should remain hidden. Perhaps they made a choice, or a series of choices, that Gehrig felt would dishonor them if exposed. Or perhaps the truth was unbearable for the families. Perhaps Gehrig, having seen what happened, concluded that the details would cause more suffering than the absence of details. Perhaps he chose silence not out of cowardice, but out of a grim kind of mercy. There is a phrase in Gehrig's response to Elizabeth Lyle that is worth revisiting. When she asked why he would not tell her how her son died, he said, "Because it would not bring him back." On the surface, this is a statement of futility, but it is also something more. It is a statement of philosophy. It suggests that Gehrig had weighed the value of truth against the cost of revelation and had concluded that truth, in this case, served no purpose. He was not saying that the truth didn't matter. He was saying that the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and that the consequences of speaking it were worse than the consequences of silence. This is a heavy burden for any person to carry, and Gehrig carried it for 34 years. He did not seek absolution. He did not write a confession to be opened after his death. He did not leave behind letters or journals that would explain his reasoning. He left nothing but the silence itself. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Gehrig understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Not because it is illegal or immoral, but because it is corrosive, because it changes the people who hear it, because it turns grief into something darker. There is a line in Valerie Marsh's thesis that captures this idea. The silence was not a refusal to testify. It was a form of testimony. It was the last act of care that Gehrig could offer the men who did not return. If this interpretation is correct, and we cannot know if it is, then Martin Gehrig was not a coward or a criminal. He was a man who saw something, understood what it meant, and made a choice to bear the weight of it alone. It is possible to admire that choice. It is also possible to condemn it. The families deserved answers. The public deserved truth. The law deserved cooperation. But perhaps Gehrig believed that what he owed the dead was more important than what he owed the living. And perhaps he was right. Or perhaps he was wrong, and the silence was simply cruelty. We will never know. What we do know is this. Martin Gehrig walked 17 miles from Ashford Gulch to Colorado Springs. He reported that he had been missing. He said 4 men were gone. He said he did not know where they had gone. And then he said nothing else. For the rest of his life, he lived with that silence. He woke with it. He worked with it. He ate and slept and aged with it. It was his companion, his burden, his choice. And when he died, he took it with him. The mine at Ashford Gulch is still there. The shafts are sealed now, filled in during a federal reclamation project in the 1950s. The camp is gone. The valley is quiet. The trees have grown over the scars. But if you go there, and some people do, drawn by the story, you will find that the silence is still present, not in the absence of sound, but in the weight of what is not said, in the questions that hang in the air, in the knowledge that something happened here and that the only man who could explain it chose not to. You can stand where Martin Gehrig stood. You can look at the mountains. You can imagine the 4 men walking toward the mine, carrying their tools and their hopes, unaware that they would never return. And you can ask yourself, if you had been the one who came back, what would you have said? Would you have told the truth no matter the cost? Or would you have done what Gehrig did? Would you have chosen silence? And if you had, would it have been out of weakness or out of something else entirely? The historian cannot answer these questions. The historian can only document what is known and acknowledge what is not. What is known: 5 men went into the wilderness, 4 disappeared, 1 returned. What is not known: why? And perhaps the most important thing to understand about the case of Martin Gehrig is this. The not knowing was not an accident of history. It was not the result of lost evidence or inadequate investigation. It was the result of a choice. A choice made by a man who believed, rightly or wrongly, that some things should not be spoken, and who carried that belief to his grave. The silence remains. It is all we have, and perhaps it is all we were ever meant to have.